"Help! He's hurting me! Stop it! Stop it right now!" The shrill scream echoed from the house like a siren, and within 10 minutes, 2 animal control trucks, a sheriff's deputy, and a squad of confused HOA board members were standing on my front lawn, guns, notepads, and clipboards at the ready. The chaos that unfolded was not from a crime, not from violence, and not from a domestic emergency, but from a 4-pound parrot named Phoenix who had, for the 5th time this month, perfectly mimicked HOA President Karen's signature scream. Only this time he added, "Get your hillbilly trash off our cul-de-sac," which sent things spiraling completely out of control. When the deputy asked who was yelling those things, I simply pointed to the cage where Phoenix fluffed his feathers, blinked once, and calmly said, "I'm the president now, loser." And that's when Karen showed up, screeching in real life, only to find she'd been outperformed by a bird. Phoenix came to me by accident, like most of the best things in life. I'd rescued him from a roadside petting zoo 2 years back when I was moonlighting as a vet tech and discovered the poor thing was being fed nothing but instant rice and pickle juice. After a few weeks in my care, he was thriving, singing opera, quoting movies, and mimicking voices with eerie precision. What I didn't know at the time was that Phoenix's cage happened to sit right next to the side window, which unfortunately faced Karen's front porch, and Karen, bless her entitled little heart, had a voice that could cut glass. She would scream at delivery men, rant at HOA board members, and even yell at squirrels for trespassing on her flower beds. Phoenix, being the sponge-brained mimic he was, soaked it all in like a feathery black box recorder. It started small. A "get off my lawn" here. Oh, that's a violation there. But then Phoenix began piecing together her tirades like a remix. Soon he could deliver a full-blown home meeting, complete with roll call, passive-aggressive remarks, and the words "motion denied" in a tone so dead on it scared my cat under the fridge. At first, I thought it was hilarious. So did the neighbors. They'd come over just to hear Phoenix shout, "This community is falling apart," followed by, "I'll have your property seized," in rapid succession. It became a neighborhood joke. People made bets about what Phoenix would say next. But the laughter died the day Phoenix's mimicry hit a little too close to home. Literally. A well-meaning neighbor walking by heard him screech in what sounded like a woman's voice yelling, "Don't hit me," put down the rake, and thought someone was being abused inside my house. They did the right thing, of course, and called it in. What happened next was a parade of official vehicles all converging on my house like it was a hostage situation. When I opened the door, a sheriff had his hand on his taser and asked if there was anyone in distress. Phoenix, sitting on his perch, replied in Karen's voice, "You can't touch me. I'm whole royalty." The sheriff blinked. The animal control officer behind him said, "What the hell?" I explained. I even showed them video clips of Phoenix doing impressions of politicians, cartoons, and even myself when I stubbed my toe. The animal control officers seemed amused. The deputy let out a short laugh. But not Karen. No, Karen arrived in her bright red Subaru like a heat-seeking missile, screeched to a stop at the curb, and practically flew up my driveway, hair blowing wildly like she'd been summoned by dark magic. "This is harassment," she yelled. "This bird is stalking me." She pointed at Phoenix as if he were a federal informant. Phoenix, ever the performer, chirped sweetly and said, "Is that a new wig, Karen? Looks cheap." The crowd lost it. Even the sheriff chuckled, but Karen wasn't laughing. That night she posted a 700-word tirade in the HOA newsletter, calling Phoenix an invasive audio weapon, and me an irresponsible exotic animal owner who posed a risk to neighborhood safety. She proposed a new emergency board meeting to discuss a revised noise ordinance and tried to have Phoenix classified as an emotional nuisance. I laughed it off at first. Surely no one would take that seriously. But I underestimated how far Karen's tentacles reached. She'd been HOA president for 6 years. She controlled the budget, the bylaws, and the whispers that passed between hedges like smoke in a battlefield. Within a week, a committee had been formed, and within 2, a draft ordinance was being reviewed. one that suspiciously only restricted the decibel range of birds over 2 pounds with vocal mimicry abilities. Meanwhile, Phoenix was getting bolder. He begun mimicking Karen's phone conversations. I didn't even realize it at first. I thought maybe he was just babbling, but then I heard, clear as day, "Judy's going to regret crossing me," in Karen's smug tone. "Then go find her and say the paint's non-compliant." Phoenix would rattle off things like, "I saw her with Mike at the tennis courts, and if she doesn't stop hosting barbecues, I'll call zoning." It was Karen's voice, unmistakably, and it wasn't just her public persona. Phoenix had captured the private Karen, the one behind closed doors. That was when I realized this wasn't just funny anymore. It was dangerous. I checked my home security footage and realized the audio from Karen's porch carried straight through the hedges and into the slightly open window where Phoenix's perch sat. He hadn't been spying. He'd just been listening. And with that razor-sharp memory, he'd become a feathery wire tap. When I tried to warn Karen that maybe she should, lower her voice or stop scheming in public, she accused me of deliberately training my bird to ruin her life. That was rich. She filed a complaint with animal control, demanding Phoenix be confiscated and relocated to a proper sanctuary away from human voices. She called the city, the county, and even tried to get me cited for violating a non-existent exotic animal broadcasting law. But I wasn't going to roll over. I filed a petition, backed by actual bird law, showing Phoenix was legally protected as part of my small-scale rescue operation. And more than that, I had neighborhood support. People were fed up with Karen. Phoenix's accidental whistleblowing had turned the tide. Neighbors who once feared speaking out were now dropping off fresh fruit for Phoenix and sharing their own stories of HOA abuse. But Karen wasn't finished. She had one more card to play. One that involved secret surveillance, a raid ordinance vote, and a last-ditch effort to turn the city against me, all because she couldn't out-talk a parrot. The emergency HOA meeting took place inside the community clubhouse, which Karen insisted be members only and locked to the public. Of course, she handpicked who counted as members. The invite list was mostly her inner circle, 3 board members who nodded on cue, a retired dentist with too much time, and that one guy who always sided with Karen because he thought it might help his fence variance. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Half the neighborhood sent me voice recordings of the entire thing afterward, and Phoenix had already rehearsed half of it that morning just from hearing Karen practicing aloud on her porch. When I heard the recording, I nearly choked on my coffee. Karen stood at the front of the clubhouse and, with the dramatic flair of a politician on cable news, declared, "We are under attack by a parrot with a criminally accurate voice print of mine." You could hear the scoffs and coughs in the background. One neighbor even muttered, "She really thinks the bird's doing identity theft." Karen marched forward with her plan to pass what she called the Vocal Disturbance and Avian Restriction Emergency Clause, a 10-page monstrosity that basically outlawed any animal that could repeat human speech within the range of 2 adjoining property lines. It was so specific it might as well have said, "one parrot owned by the weird guy on Maple Lane." She made claims about her mental health, how she was living in fear, that every morning she woke up terrified that Phoenix might scream, "Karen's lying again," while she walked to her mailbox. She even said her dog had stopped eating because it thought Karen was always yelling. The board members voted unanimously to pass the clause. 3 raised hands and a lot of murmured confusion. The thing was, whole rules didn't actually supersede city law, and I'd already filed for wildlife protection status for Phoenix under state exotic rescue code. The ordinance was toothless, but Karen, as always, didn't let facts get in her way. She posted victory flyers around the neighborhood the next day that read, "Noise ban passed. Parrot will be removed." I wasn't worried yet. I'd dealt with Karen's fake fines and passive-aggressive notices before. But then something changed. One evening I came home and noticed the side fence gate was unlatched. My motion sensor cameras caught a shadowy figure near Phoenix's window. The next morning, Phoenix began saying something new in Karen's voice. "Just record him. We'll say he trained the bird. I want him gone." My blood ran cold. Karen had planted something, some kind of listening device. I started checking everything. I found a small wireless mic duct taped under Phoenix's perch, disguised under some nesting fluff. It had been recording audio directly from inside my home. I disconnected it and filed a police report, but the officer just raised an eyebrow and said, "It's a civil issue unless you catch her doing it." Karen was getting desperate. She couldn't silence the bird, so now she wanted to frame me for harassment, flip the narrative, and make it seem like I was the one invading her privacy. The next week, Phoenix dropped a bombshell. In the middle of breakfast, while I was making toast and half listening to the local news, Phoenix turned to the open kitchen window and blurted, in Karen's exact cadence, "I paid Dan to fast-track the landscaping bid. Just bury the invoices in community improvements." I froze. Dan was on the city council's whole liaison committee. Karen had been pushing a landscaping contract for months, and there had been whisperings that the winning bid went to her cousin's company despite being nearly double the next competitor. Phoenix kept going. "No one checks the receipts anyway. Make sure it's under shade improvements and decorative mulch." My eyes widened. Phoenix had been quoting Karen's private phone calls, ones that were definitely not made outside, which meant she had been talking near open doors, or worse, her own smart devices had picked up those conversations and Phoenix had somehow absorbed them from echoing sounds through her front yard. Either way, this wasn't funny anymore. This was fraud. I started quietly gathering clips of Phoenix's statements. I didn't want to make a scene. Not yet. But when Phoenix started repeating full conversations involving budget allocations, a mysterious second holiday lighting fund, and the phrase slush account, I decided it was time to share. I anonymously dropped a flash drive into the mailbox of a neighbor who worked in municipal finance. The next morning she called me and said, "You need to hear this. This bird might be the best whistleblower we've ever had." That afternoon, Karen appeared at my door, banging hard enough to rattle the hinges. "I know what you're doing," she shrieked. "You think you're clever with your bird and your fake recordings. You trained him to sound like me." Phoenix responded before I could. "I'm the queen of the cul-de-sac, and the rest of you are trash." Karen's face went pale. She pointed at Phoenix, sputtering like she'd seen a ghost. "You manipulated that bird. I think you did that yourself," I said calmly. She stormed off, muttering about lawsuits. Later that day, animal control showed up again. This time it wasn't just a courtesy visit. They had a report filed by Karen accusing me of animal abuse, claiming Phoenix was forced to recite defamatory speech under stress. The agent, a young guy with more tattoos than patience, asked to see Phoenix's living conditions. I showed him the custom aviary, the organic food stock, the veterinary paperwork, the enrichment toys, and the sun lamp schedule. Phoenix, perfectly timed, looked at the agent and said, "Karen's wasting taxpayer money again." The guy laughed so hard he nearly dropped his clipboard. He waved me off and said, "We're good here," before adding, "Honestly, I wish more pets exposed corrupt hoes." As Karen's war against Phoenix intensified, so did the neighborhood support. People began decorating their yards with toy parrots. One kid made a TikTok account where he dubbed Phoenix's phrases over footage of Karen at meetings. A local artist even painted a mural of Phoenix wearing a judge's wig under the caption, "Order in the court." It was clear that Karen was losing her grip. But that made her more dangerous, because when entitled people realize they've become a joke, they don't step down. They dig in. Karen's final act in this chapter was subtle but chilling. A letter appeared in my mailbox with no return address. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in tight, cramped script. It read, "Either you rehome the parrot by end of month, or we do it for you. There are ways." Phoenix, sitting behind me, squawked, "You'll regret this, sweetheart." I patted his head and said, "That makes two of us." The game had shifted. Karen wasn't just trying to silence Phoenix anymore. She was threatening to make him disappear, but she had no idea just how many ears were listening or how much Phoenix remembered. The next whole meeting wasn't supposed to be eventful. Karen scheduled it under the radar, gave only select notices, and set it in a last-minute location, the clubhouse side annex, where she assumed fewer people would show up. But word had already spread. Ever since Phoenix's voice went viral on a few TikTok reposts, folks from across the neighborhood, some who hadn't attended a home meeting in years, started showing up just to see what he'd say next. And today I brought him with me, not as a stunt, not as an exhibit, but because I had every legal right to attend, and Phoenix was registered under a local therapy companion clause for my rescue work, which I made sure to point out when Karen tried to deny us entry. She stood at the door, red-lipped and fuming, but she couldn't argue the bylaws she'd helped write. Fine, she snapped, but keep him silent. Phoenix, perched calmly on my shoulder, whispered just loud enough, "Make me queen or Isu." Two neighbors nearby chuckled into their sleeves. The meeting opened with Karen rattling through her usual agenda, and for a moment, it almost seemed normal, just another boring session about shrub height and seasonal banners. But then she got to new business, and everything went off the rails. "We're here to discuss the behavior of a certain resident and his animal who has caused considerable emotional distress," she said, not bothering to hide her glare in my direction. "This is a community emergency," she added, slamming a folder onto the table. Before she could continue, Phoenix let out a pitch-perfect imitation of her voice, saying, "I'm the only one who matters here." Half the room gasped. The other half cracked up. Karen's face turned an impossible shade of red. "See," she barked, "he's doing it again. That is targeted harassment." I calmly raised a hand. "With respect, ma'am, my parrot is merely repeating things he hears in public. If those things are upsetting, perhaps we should talk about why they're being said in the first place." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Phoenix added, "I faked the budget increase. Sue me." The room fell into stunned silence, and just like that, everyone's attention turned from my bird to the woman at the head of the table, who suddenly looked like she was standing on a trapdoor. One of the board members whispered, "Wait, what budget increase?" Karen scrambled to change the subject, demanding a motion to fine me for disturbing the peace. But before she could finish, a teenage girl from the back row stood up with her phone. "I have something to show everyone," she said, tapping on her screen. The footage played out loud. It was a compilation, edited together like a greatest hits album, of Phoenix repeating line after line in Karen's voice. "That woman's fence is 3 inches too tall. Tell them we lost the paperwork. Just move the funds. No one reads the ledgers." The clip ended with Phoenix chirping, "Call Dan, he'll cover for me." People started murmuring, then shouting over one another. It was chaos in khakis and cardigans. Karen screamed for order, pounding her gavel so hard the head snapped off. But no one was listening anymore. The meeting erupted into a shouting match between board members, homeowners, and Karen herself, who was now sweating so hard her foundation was dripping down her jawline. Someone called for an audit. Another demanded her resignation. A man near the window yelled, "That bird has more transparency than this whole board combined." Phoenix squawked, "Impeach the queen." And that's when Karen snapped, in front of the entire room. She lunged across the table, trying to grab Phoenix off my shoulder. She didn't even make it halfway before she tripped over her own chair lay and crashed into a folding table, knocking over pitchers of water and a stack of whole newsletters. Everyone gasped. Phoenix, unfazed, flapped once and perched atop a speaker, declaring, "This meeting is adjourned due to treason." Karen scrambled to her feet, dripping and humiliated, and stormed out without saying a word. The meeting dissolved shortly after. No votes were cast. No minutes were recorded, but a dozen people caught the whole thing on their phones. By the next morning, the clip was everywhere. Local news ran it under the headline, "Parrot outs HOA President's Budget Secrets." National outlets picked it up for the absurdity, adding background music and mocking graphics. There were GIF memes. One video had Phoenix's voice over dramatic court music with the caption, "Objection from the bird." My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My inbox exploded. People wanted to interview Phoenix. Podcasts were asking me to come on and talk about neighborhood governance reform. A city councilman even reached out anonymously saying, "Whatever that parrot's picking up, it's worth listening to." Karen, predictably, doubled down. She filed a formal defamation lawsuit against me and Phoenix. Yes, the parrot was named on the paperwork. She claimed emotional distress, reputational damage, and financial losses due to ongoing bird-based sabotage. My attorney, who I hired on retainer just in case things got weirder, laughed so hard he almost fell out of his chair when he read the complaint. You can't sue a bird for repeating what a person says out loud, he said, especially not when that person is standing on a porch yelling it at the wind. Still, the lawsuit triggered another visit from animal control, this time with a more senior officer and a clipboard as thick as a phone book. They wanted to document Phoenix's living conditions, record his speech patterns, and review complaints. I complied fully. I gave them vet records, diet logs, enrichment routines, even a daily journal he kept on what Phoenix learned each day. After nearly 2 hours, the lead officer looked up from his notes and said, "Honestly, this bird's smarter than some people I've worked with." Then he leaned in and added, "Off the record, between you and me, sounds like he's doing the community a service." Karen, however, was not backing off. The very next day, she returned not with animal control, but with a pair of private security goons wearing dark suits and earpieces like they were auditioning for a knockoff spy film. They stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, as Karen held up a megaphone and declared that Phoenix was an unauthorized surveillance device and must be surrendered immediately. "This is your last warning," she screamed. "You've got 24 hours to hand over the parrot, or I will take legal custody." Phoenix responded by flapping down to the front porch railing and in Karen's voice said, "Please, someone call a therapist." Laughter erupted from several nearby homes. One neighbor filmed the whole thing and shouted, "Are you getting this for season 2? The state investigator returned the next morning, not alone this time but with 2 more officials from the Municipal Fraud Division and a briefcase full of printed transcripts. I barely had time to pour my coffee when they pulled into the driveway, stepped out in business casual uniforms, and asked very politely if Phoenix would be willing to perform. I laughed, then said, "If he's in the mood, sure, but he charges in sunflower seeds now." They smiled, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Phoenix had recently learned to squawk, "No seeds, no speak," and had begun holding his best impressions hostage until I dropped a few into his tray. Today, however, he seemed ready for the spotlight. He fluffed his feathers, stretched his wings, and then launched into a near-perfect reenactment of an home meeting that had occurred 3 weeks prior, one that I had not attended but had certainly heard about through the grapevine. As Phoenix recited line after line in Karen's clipped tone, the investigators took notes furiously, glancing at each other with widening eyes every time the bird dropped a new phrase like, "Bury the invoice under dog park expenses," or "Dan's cousin will kick back 10%. The oldest investigator, a graying man with a voice like gravel, finally leaned back and said, "Do you have any idea what kind of gold mine you're sitting on?" I raised an eyebrow and asked if he meant Phoenix or the mountain of whole corruption. "Both," he replied, "but mostly the bird." They thanked me for my cooperation, asked me not to alert Karen or any board members that an official inquiry had begun, and promised to be discreet, as if that were even possible anymore. By that afternoon, Phoenix's latest viral video had made the rounds again, this time on a late-night talk show where the host imitated Karen yelling at a garbage can while the parrot screamed back about mulch embezzlement. The clip was short, absurd, and devastating. Karen's reputation was now a national punchline. I wasn't surprised when she showed up at my doorstep that evening, shaking, furious, and oddly desperate. She didn't scream. She didn't yell. She just stood there, clutching a legal folder and a half-wilted whole handbook like a child holding broken toys. "Please," she said, "call it off." I blinked. "Call what off?" "The jokes, the truth, the bird." Her voice cracked. "The investigation, the videos. I know you have pull with people now. I've seen the interviews. Just make it stop." I didn't answer right away. I watched her for a moment. This woman who had marched around like royalty for years, now shaking on my porch as her kingdom crumbled under the weight of her own hypocrisy. "You called animal control on my bird," I said quietly. twice. You tried to have him removed, accused me of animal abuse, and planted illegal surveillance equipment in my house. Why would I stop now?" Karen didn't answer. She just turned, stumbled down the steps, and drove off with her tail between her legs. Phoenix, perched inside by the window, murmured, "Pathetic," and then coughed out a laugh. That same week, the whole board held an emergency vote. Karen had been suspended pending the results of the city's investigation, which had grown from financial misconduct into full-blown fraud. Her closest allies abandoned her immediately, claiming they had no knowledge of her personal actions. The man who always sided with her for his fence variance was suddenly a vocal critic, demanding an audit going back 3 years. It was like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Only this ship had a parrot at the helm and a microphone in his beak. In her absence, a temporary chairwoman named Linda took over, and one of her first actions was to reach out to me personally. She brought over muffins, a handwritten thank you card, and a formal request asking if Phoenix would be willing to speak at the next open forum. I told her Phoenix didn't do politics, but he did accept applause and blueberries. Meanwhile, Karen hadn't disappeared. She'd gone underground, still filing frivolous motions and legal threats from behind closed doors. I received no less than 4 certified letters in 2 days, each with increasingly absurd accusations. Phoenix was allegedly part of a coordinated psychological warfare campaign. I was accused of impersonating a city official using Parrot technology, and my favorite, that Phoenix had violated her privacy rights by repeating things she said too clearly. My lawyer had a folder titled Karen's Circus just for these filings, which he read through while sipping his morning coffee and laughing until he coughed. Still, despite the humor, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something bigger, something unhinged. Then 2 nights later, I caught her on my security camera. She was dressed in all black, wearing gloves, and tiptoeing through my backyard like a cartoon burglar. She made it to Phoenix's aviary before I even registered the alert on my phone. By the time I got downstairs, she was fiddling with the latch. What she didn't realize was that I had upgraded the lock after the first threat, and I'd added a motion-triggered speaker that blared Phoenix's voice anytime someone approached without authorization. She heard it right as her fingers touched the cage door. "Karen, this is trespassing. I'm calling the sheriff." Phoenix's voice rang out, amplified through the outdoor speakers. Karen screamed, spun around, and ran straight into a lawn gnome, tripping and landing face first in a bed of mint plants. I stood on the back porch, recording the whole thing on my phone as she tried to scramble to her feet. "Smile for the neighborhood watch," I said calmly, "and maybe try a new disguise next time." She was arrested that night for trespassing and attempted animal theft. The deputy didn't even try to hide his grin as he put her in the cruiser. "Bird tried to warn her," he muttered. Phoenix, ever dramatic, fluttered down from his perch and crooned, "Bad Karen. Bad, bad Karen." The next day, the entire neighborhood held an impromptu block party. Someone printed T-shirts with Phoenix's face on them. A group of teenagers walked around offering bird justice lemonade. Linda made a toast with sparkling cider, thanking Phoenix for his civic duty and accidental surveillance. I gave him extra blueberries and let him watch cartoons for an hour straight. The city's final report came out 2 weeks later. Karen was officially found to have misused HOA funds, falsified maintenance logs, redirected landscaping contracts to family members, and forged signatures on 2 community ballots. She was banned from holding any HOA position ever again and fined an amount that would have paid for a full community pool upgrade. The whole board voted to enact new transparency measures, and someone even proposed a Phoenix clause requiring all home meetings to be recorded and made publicly available within 24 hours. Phoenix's legacy, apparently, was permanent. As for Karen, she moved out a month later at night in silence with a moving truck and no fanfare. I watched from the porch as her SUV disappeared down the road, her house empty and dark behind her. Phoenix sighed, long and dramatic, and said, "Ding dong, the witch is gone." I didn't teach him that. He picked it up on his own, probably from the neighbors, but it fit. It was over. Or so I thought, because the last box Karen had left behind was labeled records private, and what I found inside would change everything. The box had been sitting behind Karen's old garden shed, barely visible under a half-rotten tarp, and wedged between two cracked lawn chairs like it was just another piece of garbage left behind. If the new neighbors hadn't started clearing out the overgrowth, they might have missed it entirely. One of them, a retired Marine with a buzz cut and a metal detector hobby, had tugged it free and brought it straight to me. "Figured you'd know what to do with something labeled Co-Records Private," he said with a knowing smirk. The box was water-stained, the corners soft from age and moisture, but the contents inside were dry. Dozens of folders, handwritten notes, annotated ballots, expense spreadsheets, and a thick yellow envelope marked "Official Use Only. Do Not Share." Phoenix tilted his head when I opened it and said in Karen's voice, "If this ever gets out, I'm done for." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just more of the same. This was her insurance policy or her ticking time bomb. I sat up late into the night, combing through the documents, each page worse than the last. It was clear Karen hadn't just misused funds or bullied the neighborhood with rules she made up on the fly. She had been running a full-scale scheme for years, inflated maintenance costs with fake contractors, duplicate invoices for landscaping that never happened, ghost reimbursements to board members who no longer lived in the neighborhood. There was even an entire section on how to manufacture non-compliance notices for residents she didn't like. One note read, "Repeat violations stick even if fake. Paper trail equals power." Phoenix, watching from his perch, fluffed his feathers and repeated softly, "Paper trail equals power." Then added, "Burn it later." I didn't know if he was quoting Karen or offering advice. Either way, I knew I had to act. By morning, I was in touch with the same state investigator who had led the fraud inquiry. He drove over in person within the hour. When I handed him the envelope, he flipped through the first few pages, closed it, and said, "Well, she just upgraded herself from a fine to a felony." They opened a new case that day, not just into Karen, but into the city liaison who'd fast-tracked her proposals, the cousin listed on 5 of the phony contracts, and the fake vendors. They pulled years of whole budgets for cross-reference, requested city permits and county tax filings, and subpoenaed whole meeting minutes Karen never thought anyone would question. I'd started this war with a Parrot and a grudge, and now it was turning into a full-blown legal takedown of corruption at a level none of us had imagined. Word spread quickly. The local news returned to do a follow-up segment. Only this time, it wasn't just about Phoenix's antics. It was about fraud, abuse of power, and how an unassuming bird with a sharp ear brought it all crashing down. They interviewed me on my front porch, and the segment ended with Phoenix leaning into the mic and saying, "Karen who?" The clip went viral again, but this time the tone wasn't just comedic. People were furious. Neighbors who had paid absurd fines for meaningless infractions began comparing notes. Residents from other neighborhoods started digging into their own HOA records. There was a ripple effect, a sudden demand for transparency, and Phoenix, without ever trying, had become the face of a movement. The whole board, now fully under Linda's leadership, held a special community forum, the first fully open door, live-streamed meeting in years. Attendance broke every record. People brought folding chairs, snacks, and even signs. One read, "In Phoenix we trust." Another, "Birds aren't the problem. Karen was." Linda opened with a speech about rebuilding trust and ensuring that something like this could never happen again. Then she turned to me and said, "Would you and Phoenix like to say a few words?" I hadn't planned anything, but I walked up anyway. Phoenix perched proudly on my shoulder. This little guy was just doing what parrots do, listening and repeating. The real problem, I said, scanning the crowd, was that what he heard was never meant to see daylight. This isn't just about a bird with a sharp tongue. It's about accountability. And now that we've seen behind the curtain, let's make sure we never look away again. The crowd applauded. Phoenix squawked, "Truth always flies." And someone shouted, "Put that on a shirt." Over the next few weeks, things shifted fast. Karen was formally indicted on multiple counts of fraud, falsification of public documents, and conspiracy to defraud a community association. Her cousin was arrested too. Dan, the Shady City Lazen, resigned quietly before charges could hit his desk. The whole bylaws were rewritten from the ground up, with new checks, term limits, and public financial disclosures. I even helped create a community oversight committee that included random resident selection, just to keep power from consolidating again. No more queens of the cul-de-sac. No more secret fines. No more vendettas disguised as regulations. The best part, though, came when the city council passed a motion, half symbolic, half policy-driven, called the Parrot Protection Resolution. It recognized Phoenix's accidental contribution to public oversight and created a small grant program to support animal-assisted education programs. A local muralist painted a giant piece on the wall of the community center, Phoenix mid-squawk, a scroll of HOA documents in his talons, and a banner that read, "Let truth take flight." Phoenix's eyes were rendered in perfect detail, sharp and wide, like he was always listening. I settled back into my usual life, more or less. The press calls slowed down. The neighborhood calmed. The house was quiet again, except, of course, for Phoenix, who still delivered his daily commentary like a feathery talk show host. Meeting adjourned. He'd say when I turned off the lights. "You're all guilty," he muttered once while watching courtroom TV. And sometimes, just for fun, he'd repeat that one Karen line in a perfectly nasal tone. Violation notice incoming. It made me smile every time. Karen,